As with the Neo-Assyrian sources, several different types of kitchen managers are attested in the Middle Assyrian textual material, including the chief cook, Rab Nu Atem Mi, the chief confectioner, Rab Kirkandini, the chief baker, Rab Allah Inni, the chief brewer, Rab Saras, and the chief oil presser, Rab-a-Itti, assumed that they presided over rather small groups of individuals, maybe comprising of about 10 people. Hence, several chief cooks or chief confectioners may have been active at the same time. In any case, it was already in the Middle Assyrian period that the office of chief cook in particular developed into a more complex role, since one of its holders was eponym in the reign of Assur-nadin-apli, early 12th century, as was the chief cook Sa-ilu in the Neo-Assyrian period. The occurrence of the title of chief cook in a fragmentary inscription on an Assur stele, perhaps accompanied by a reference to the chief confectioner, underlines this impression and suggests that also the office of the chief confectioner could be represented by a prominent figure at that time. Unfortunately, we lack concrete evidence for the tasks of the Middle Assyrian chief cook, but it is likely that the responsibilities of the chief cook of the royal household were similar to what we learned from the Neo-Assyrian evidence. Support for this suggestion comes from the archives of the Offerings House in Assur, headed by the Rab Gena-e, Offerings Overseer. According to its written remnants, this department administered cereals, sesame, syrup or honey, and fruits provided by the province for the regular offerings in the Assur temple. Who dealt with this archive recently point out the lack of domestic animals or meat, which formed already in Middle Assyrian times an integral component of provincial provisions for offerings in the Assur temple. According to Gaspa, this may have been simply owed to the different way of record keeping, but Postgate goes to step further and suggests a different system for supplying the Assur temple with meat, given that there already existed an office of Rab Nu Atemi of apparently enhanced status. I suggest that already in the Middle Assyrian period of Atemi the chief cook was responsible for the management of meat needed for the divine meal, and as a consequence, the king's meal. There is evidence for a rather regular provision of bread, beer, and oil by the Offerings House for the palace, which also involved leftovers from offerings. But it is clearly support and that the palace had other resources for the supply of these commodities. Also, the supply of meat for the palace and temple may have been maintained by more than one department, as indicated by another archive found in Assur between the Anu Adad temple and the old palace. The owner of the archive was the Fatner Muta, also bearing the titles Sa Resi and Zuraku, who took care of the livestock which was brought as audience gifts, Nemertu, to the palace. These gifts were delivered by provincial governors, local stewards, or treasurers, etc., for the benefit of the prince Inerta Takalti Assur in the reign of Assur-Dan I. The incoming cattle were meant for the mills of Inerta Takalti Assur, for the feeding of the lions kept by the palace, for exorcists and the performance of sacrifice, and for the expenditure of personal gifts, Remutu. Hence, the wide range of uses of cattle administered by a single department may remind us of the Neo-Assyrian period. Apart from the majority of the text representing a unilateral documentation for internal usage, there is a sealed account of cattle received and issued over half a year, ratified by a certain Pu'ah, according to the other references to this man within Muta's archive and elsewhere, whose title is unknown, concluded that he was closely associated with Muta and perhaps his immediate superior, assuming that the office of chief cook had overall responsibilities for the meat supply. Pu'ah seems to be a suitable candidate for this position, who, in his official capacity, supervised departments at a lower administrative level. As to managers concerned with distinct types of foodstuff, we do not find the same titles that are known for the Neo-Assyrian period. Instead, singular references to a Samu-e-Samni and a Samu-e-Karani, the titles Rab-Samni and Rab-Karani respectively, assuming that the Samu-e-Samni and the Samu-e-Karani likewise managed the supply of oil and wine for the palace. The administration of these commodities on behalf of the palace was managed by separate departments, as was the case in the first millennium BCE. When we look for administrators of grain and grain storage facilities in the Middle Assyrian sources, however, there are no references to offices such as the Rab Karmani and Kab Dinabati. I am also not aware of attestations of any equivalent term or other official designation that might suggest a similar occupation. However, as we have seen, royal grain storage facilities called Karmu were distributed over the urban centers in the Middle Assyrian period, and these needed to be managed, for the royal Kamu in Assur refers to two families with close ties to the king and his household, which seem to have been responsible for it and ran the royal Karmu as a family business. It is also a question of designation and whether the administration of the Karmu Karmus bore the title Rab Karmani or Rab Karmai, or another similar title does not change the fact that they had the same function. We can nevertheless observe one significant difference compared with the circumstances in the Neo-Assyrian period. We do not have evidence for the Rab Karmani or his food-managing colleagues active in the royal household, exercising their office within an elite family network where the son typically follows his father in office. Admittedly, this is primarily a matter of sources, and while several Middle Assyrian administrative archives were unearthed in Assur, we lack comparable material from the succeeding period. However, there is reason to assume that in Neo-Assyrian times, the king preferred to appoint independent and professionally skilled men to these offices. This possible change in the bureaucratic ethos also involved the more frequent appointment of Resus to state offices as Ram among the Neo-Assyrian food managers. Only Anurta Ea succeed, a chief of the cooks, and the herdsman is designated Sa-Rezi of Adad Nirari III on his cylinder sill. In the standard formula of his grants of tax exemption, Assurbanipal describes himself as the one who always behaves kindly towards the Sa-Rezi who serve him. Sa-ana lu su et seg mes man za az pa ni su ita na ba lu ina dam qua ati. Although the beneficiaries themselves, including the Rab Sa-Rezi, the chamberlain, and the fodder master, are not directly referred to as Sa-Rezi, it is likely that they were addressed with this introductory statement. Though this remains unproven, it could indicate that middle-ranking palace offices such as that of the fodder master, but also of the granary master and other food managing offices, were held by the same class of men, namely Sa-Rezis. Whether or not this means eunuch or rather courtier is such a standardized document. Assurbanipal's use of the term Sa-Rezi in this context indicates a systematic or unified treatment of his officials according to the Middle Assyrian sources, especially the common palace personnel and the Quipu agents of the king were designated Sa-Rezi. By contrast, the highest state offices were maintained by the elite families and their houses over generations, and their office holders, the magnates, Rabbi Anu, were possibly distinguished from the Saranu. Cases such as the provincial governor and treasurer, Namkur Sari, who is attested with the title Sa-Rezi, seem to have been rather exceptional. Like state offices were preferably staffed with eunuchs in Neo-Assyrian times, the same change in policy may have affected the lower level of administration, including the food management. However, we should not expect an abrupt and overall change, but rather a steady development with fluctuations towards a professionalization of the different administrative levels. Although we catch a glimpse of this policy already in the Middle Assyrian period, this was developed much further in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The latter administration is also characterized by the illustration of deputies, saniu, beneath state officials and court officials, including the food managing offices, a custom which is rarely known from the Middle Assyrian period and that can also be taken as a sign of increasing professionalization. While at a first sight one expects significant differences in the way food was managed for the royal household in the two periods, the basic administrative structures and distribution of responsibilities, meat, grain, wine, etc., also exists in the Middle Assyrian period, as did the strong reciprocal relationship between palace and temple. Based on these foundations, the food management apparatus, along with the entire Neo-Assyrian administration, developed further into a more complex and also a more rational system.